What's up everybody, how's it going? It's Burke aka Dansgaway, and this is a huge day for the Final Fantasy fanbase. Last night I came home after like an 18-hour crazy trek trying to bring Coco home from Istanbul to London. It was madness, but I was just extremely knackered. I was just about to sleep and I saw my social media absolutely blow up and I was like, what's going on? I did not think it was going to happen, but in the Sony event last night they had a 4-minute reveal trailer for Final Fantasy 16. I was really shocked, but I was absolutely knackered, and because I knew it was like a proper trailer, I was like, I really need my sleep. Let me get my sleep in, because I was just absolutely out of it. I got my sleep, woke up in the morning, got some coffee, sat in front of the screen and watched it back a few times, and I'm here to share some initial thoughts and reactions with you guys. Because the energy of the Final Fantasy fanbase is just so awesome, and we've all been waiting for this for such a long time. So let me break down what I think of it, and what we can maybe expect to see, maybe a little bit of background information that if you guys haven't been doing some digging yourselves you might not know. I'll share some of that stuff with you guys along with my initial thoughts, and we can start the ball rolling for Final Fantasy 16 on the channel. So this is legit, I was really not expecting this, I was stunned. What we have, the most noticeable thing for me of course, was that the setting is completely different from the sort of thing we've been experiencing recently. And for me, that's a great thing. That's something I'm definitely excited about. So looking at the setting, it looked like a much more medieval setting, reminded me a little bit of what I've seen of like Witcher 3, that kind of thing. So it has that sort of style. And given what we've had recently with Final Fantasy 15, 13 was pretty futuristic, 7 Remake, especially the first part which is in Midgar, we've seen a lot of that stuff. You know, we've seen a lot of mechs, we've fought a lot of mechs, there's been a lot of technology and futuristic cities and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, it's good in doses, but I do feel like Final Fantasy needed a game like this. If this had been yet another game that was like 15 in the sense of kind of just being sort of futuristic and you've got cars and tall buildings and all that kind of thing, I think it would have started to wear thin. So I'm happy about the change of scenery in that sense. So that's a good thing. The next thing, the biggest sort of question I had was, we got 7 Remake Part 2, which is featuring all of like the heavy hitters that we know from the mainline series of Final Fantasy, the single player game. So of course your Kitases, you know, Toriyama, Nojima, Nomura, all these kind of people. And I'm like, but if most of these guys are busy with Remake Part 2, who is going to be making Final Fantasy 16 and when? And that's when I had to kind of do a bit more digging and find out who is in charge of this game, who's actually making it. And I found out that you saw Business Unit 3, and it turns out that those guys, I didn't know, were the guys who are behind Final Fantasy 14, and especially the latter parts of Final Fantasy 14. So I think this is going to be important to talk about, because I believe this is the first mainline sort of Final Fantasy game in a long time that does not feature some of the most common names that we know from the development and directorial side of the game. So the producer of this game is a guy called Naoki Yoshida, and the guy who's actually directing the game is called Hiroshi Takai. Now for me personally, if you've watched the channel and you follow the channel, you'll know that Final Fantasy 14 is not something that I've ever gotten into, and for that reason, mainly, I didn't really know who these guys were. So for a little bit of background based on what I've been able to find out from links people have sent me and reading that I've done about it, the main reason why people should be excited about what's going on here is because of the involvement of Creative Business Unit 3. So we can't really talk about this without talking about Final Fantasy 14. Final Fantasy 14 is a game that, based on pretty much at this stage hundreds of people I've spoken to over the years about the game, whose opinions I've gotten, it's a game that when it first came out, it was trash. It took a long time to get going, but then they turned it around and they turned it into some of the best Final Fantasy story content as well that has been done in recent years. So if you talk to Final Fantasy 14 fans at this stage, everything from pretty much Heavensward onwards, they really, really love, and they think it's some of the best stuff that Square Enix has made for Final Fantasy. That's the kind of reports that I've gotten. And as I understand it, the guys who are going to be behind Final Fantasy 16 are the same guys that helped turn around the fortunes of Final Fantasy 14. So you can apparently, if you are a Final Fantasy 14 person, you'll see influence from Final Fantasy 14 in this one. And considering who is behind it, I think it looks like the game is in good hands. So if we put together the fact that they've decided to deviate away from the futuristic / modern Final Fantasy, and we have the people from 14 who turned 14 around in charge. That sounds like a good combination to me, so that's something I'm definitely excited about seeing. Outside of 14, I believe some of these guys have involvement with Final Fantasy Tactics, which is another one that people pitch to me very often as a great game. I heard Vagrant Story being thrown around as well. It's a game / story I know nothing about, but it's sounding interesting. So there's a lot of good Final Fantasy experiences linked to the guys who are involved. The only problem is that I'm personally not someone who's got to experience those good things. So that's why the hype that I feel about that side of things is kind of a, I don't know how to explain, it's like a second-hand hype, if that makes sense, because if I had played those games, then I'd have my own personal experiences to go on about whether that's great or not. But at this stage, I have to pretty much trust the opinions of everyone else I've heard over the years. And that, to me, is enough, because I speak to so many people on an almost daily basis about Final Fantasy that collectively over the years, I'm able to form what I think is a pretty good opinion on how people view certain Final Fantasy games and experiences. And when it comes to it, Final Fantasy 14 for me, I think that the consensus is pretty fair to say is that it started off poorly, it became great later on, and for anyone who wants to play it now, it's difficult to get into. It's a slog for like the first, I don't know, maybe 50 to 100 hours even. But if you manage to make it over that slump and you get to the Heavensward expansion, then from there things get pretty amazing. And it's these guys who made it amazing who are the ones responsible for 16. So if you take that into consideration, even if you haven't played it yourself, there's more reasons to be excited than concerned at the moment, for sure. If we start looking more into the trailer itself and what we see, that's where I'm a little bit more kind of, I'm not like super extremely excited and hyped, but it's mainly because everything I'm saying now is just based off a 4-minute trailer. I'm sure there's a huge amount of things that we don't know about the story yet, we don't know about the world yet. That's all going to come, but just based on the 4 minutes of content that I saw, in terms of like the design and the world and that kind of stuff, I would say the characters looked a little bit generic to me. Like when I'm watching the trailer, there wasn't really many characters I saw that sort of leapt out to me as being like, oh, these characters look super cool, or like a super badass, or whatever other adjective you want to use. Like the characters didn't really look that interesting or appealing to me, which, you know, wasn't the best. It looked like a fusion of like Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 12 NPCs. Like that's the vibe I got from the characters that we've seen so far in this trailer. That being said, the summons look pretty cool. I mean, the Shiva that we saw, Titan, we saw Phoenix make a return in this game, which looks really cool, and we saw Ifrit. I'm pretty sure that's Ifrit at the end, which is looking much more like monstrous and beastly towards the end, which I like to see. The Malboro looks cool. You could tell it looks a lot like the 7 remake Malboro, but seeing that was also nice. In that sense, I wasn't like overly excited. I don't think like the characters looked like all that like amazing. And also, to continue from that vein, world-wise, like I like the fact that it's in a more medieval setting. To be perfectly honest, is usually not my personal preference of setting. I'm not a huge fan of that stuff. But just by the fact that it's not yet another modern Final Fantasy game is something that I'm on board with, and something that I'm definitely still excited about. But just as like a personal taste thing, I'm not usually big on these medieval things. But Game of Thrones did turn that round a little bit. So I absolutely loved Game of Thrones from season 1 to 7. And of course it's set more in this sort of environment. So that was something that has increased my interest and my likelihood of liking something from that sort of era. Another area in which I feel like I wish I could have seen more from this trailer, given that it's 4 minutes long and it's the first reveal of the trailer, was maybe a little bit more of like the magic and the sort of environmental wow factor. So if you look at like the Shiva scene, for example, and most of like the outdoorsy sort of places that we've seen so far, they're all kind of rocky, hilly, bland sort of looking places. I can't recall a shot in the trailer where there was like a visual thing where I was like, whoa, like that looks really cool. I'm thinking maybe more of that stuff is reserved for like the content that's still to come, which, okay, fine. But when it comes to like the visual wow factor for me, especially with the modern Final Fantasies from like 10 onwards, whenever I would see, like, there's locations and there's moments in Final Fantasy games and trailers where I think there's a visual wow factor. So, you know, off the top of my head, like Final Fantasy X's Dream Zanarkand, to me, yes, it's a futuristic city, but like the water theme that it has in that city, like I think it looks like a really interesting, eye-catching sort of place. Final Fantasy 12, you have like the sky city of Bujeba, which looks incredible. You have Final Fantasy 13, you have like places like Eden. You have the shot of like when the party first arrives on Grand Pulse, and you see what Grand Pulse looks like. It looks really like enchanting, magical, mysterious, beautiful. Final Fantasy 15 had its moments like that too. With this trailer, like, I think that the summons for me were probably the things that looked the most visually impressive, and I did like how they looked. But environmentally, it just looked a bit bland to me. Like, it didn't excite me environmentally. There was too much sort of bland hills and rocks, and just indoor sort of places within these medieval towns and villages and whatever. So I would have liked to have seen more of that. It doesn't mean that it's not there in the game. It's just that for the first trailer, I do kind of wish I saw more of that kind of stuff. So in terms of like what I wasn't hugely hyped by, I would say what I saw of the characters and the visual sort of environment so far, I wasn't like huge on. In terms of what I'm looking forward to seeing as we move forward is, of course, what is the story looking like it's going to be. I'm trusting in the Final Fantasy XIV fan base, and I'm trusting in the people that have turned the fortunes of Final Fantasy XIV around in the sense of giving us a good narrative. We've got the crystal thing going on. I personally am not huge on like the whole crystal thing. I got into Final Fantasy in an era, and my favourite Final Fantasies don't often contain the whole crystal thing. So, Final Fantasy 7 to 10 pretty much are my favourites. The top 4 Final Fantasies for me are 7 to 10. Of the ones I've played so far, I haven't played 6 yet, but I will play very soon. And those ones, they don't really have like the whole crystal thing going on. So Final Fantasy 15, you had like the crystal, that was like kind of a focal point in the story. Final Fantasy 13 is like Mythos. It was called like the Fabula Nova Crystallis thing. So it had like a bit of a crystal thing going on with that. 12 was, even though I don't think they were all called crystals, but you had like shards and crystals and obtaining those and all that kind of thing. So like to me, like my favourite stories of Final Fantasy have been games that don't have like the crystal thing going on. That's not to say that this story can't be good because it has crystals in it, but just like if you look at the correlation, my favourite Final Fantasy games have been not stories about like getting a crystal or like, destroying a crystal and that sort of thing. So in that sense, the crystal, I didn't see like the crystal narrative and get particularly excited by it, but we know so little about what's going to happen at this point that it would be silly of me to try and extrapolate it to the final game and be like, as a result of this, I think the final game's not going to have a good story or anything like that. It's totally just reaction based on what I've seen of 4 minutes of footage, so don't read too heavily into it because I'm definitely not. So in terms of story, I think we don't have very much to go on at all at the moment, but like one of the things that's of course a little bit interesting is nearer the end you get like the whole, I'm going to kill you business, and then you've got the two faces sort of being cut like next to each other, and then you have the two different coloured swirling flames, which again, like a Song of Ice and Fire, reminded me of a little bit of Game of Thrones Season 8 with the zombie dragon, and it's like blue flame versus the red flames of the other dragon. So we might have like two opposing sides, or maybe we have a dual story going on. Maybe again, like it also reminded me a little bit of Final Fantasy 15 in that sense. So we had like Arden and his brother, and that whole narrative with those two guys sort of being on opposite sides kind of thing as well later on in the story. So that's also something that's of intrigue, but it's way too early to try and speculate on what that story might be, other than the fact that perhaps we might have a bit of a sort of a parallel story going on, and maybe you'll have like dual protagonists on either side, potentially, I don't know. Final Fantasy doesn't tend to let you play as the villain as much. I can't recall many situations where that's happened, if at all. I remember obviously the Arden DLC where Arden's the villain of 15, but you get to play as him in the DLC and learn his story and why he became who he was. Maybe they lean into that sort of storytelling a bit more heavily, where we get to play the game more as a villain, and the line between who's a villain and who's not is going to become blurred. We had The Last of Us 2 this year, which was absolutely huge on that. Like the discussion around that game and its story in that sense was just massive. Not always maybe for the best, but I mean just narratively, just as pure speculation on what they might be doing story-wise, there is a situation like that. So we have like the little kid's guardian, and then we have like the other guy who looks like he's from a different tribe of people, and then we have the crystal thing that look like they're on opposing sides, and then we've got like the blue flame versus red flame. So speculate as you will, but there's not too much we can really say about it right now, other than there could be some interesting and maybe slightly different stuff to what we know coming, especially since the storytellers aren't the same storytellers that most of us are used to from the mainline Final Fantasy we've played so far. But I'm sure 14 fans have a lot to say about that. Also, I want to know more about what's going to happen with the magic and with the gameplay, because I feel like if we're coming back to the more medieval sort of times, I want to see more magic as well. Like, I want to see more sorcery kind of stuff happening as well. I think the trailer focused a bit more on the swordplay and the action elements, but I mean, you did see like a few little spurts of him using magic and that kind of thing, but I do feel like I'd like to see a bit more of like mage type characters and like the magic going on, maybe tech using magic. I mean, magic tech is always way more cooler and more Final Fantasy than just like straight up people using like cell phones and big screens and that kind of thing. So I think seeing that stuff's going to be interesting too. And once again, I'm pretty sure it's in the game and it's going to feature in a significant way in the game, but it just, in this first trailer, it hasn't really been shown off as much. It's more about the sort of action stuff, the sword. We had the Dragoon fight, which looked pretty cool. You know, the guys stringing together combos and all that kind of stuff. So in that sense, I'm not like that stuff. Okay, fine. Like, you know, it's the modern age now. This is just how it goes. Every Final Fantasy pretty much that comes out from now on is going to have that sort of dynamic, higher energy action battle sort of system. I don't think we're ever going to go back to the sort of pace and style of like the Final Fantasies that predate 15, let's say. I don't think that's really going to happen again. But in terms of like, is this a good or bad thing? For me, Final Fantasy VII Remake showed that it can definitely be done in a way that can satisfy a lot of players. It's never going to be for everybody, and there's always going to be players that don't like it and they just want to go back to the old sort of Final Fantasy way of playing games. I don't think it's going to happen, but I guess, you know, you can always dream and hope that maybe it does. I don't know. But this game, I feel like, you know, if you look at the gameplay and the action, it looks more 15 than, you know, any other Final Fantasy. But like I say, 7 Remake gives me hope because they started to find a better balance of how to mix in sort of magic with the heavier action, swordplay, and all that kind of stuff. So I feel like they've got a good blueprint from that, and I think they're gonna kind of take stuff that they've learned from the Final Fantasy VII Remake and apply it to Final Fantasy 16. So I'm not hugely worried about the gameplay so far. We haven't seen enough. We haven't really seen, like, because it's all, there's no HUD on any of the content. We don't really know how it looks and how it plays. We just have some flashy shots of like the guy using some swordplay and a few spells here and there. But in terms of how integrated is magic into the world, in terms of the characters and the environments and the technology of the time, that's something I'm definitely looking forward to seeing as we move forward. So yeah, those are my general reactions to it. I'm hyped because of the time period that it's happening in. I like the fact that they've deviated away from the sort of worlds that they were creating in Final Fantasy 15. I'm also happy about who's in charge and how it's happening, mainly off the back of my trust of what people have been saying about Final Fantasy 14. In those guys, I definitely trust, because it would be silly, I think, to assume that pretty much all of those people are wrong about how good they are at telling stories. So it feels like this Final Fantasy 14 team is good at what they do, and if anyone other than the likes of Kitase is going to bring us a good Final Fantasy story, it feels like it's going to be these guys. So I'm definitely excited for that. The stuff I'm less excited about is more, I think, because of the specifics of what we've seen in the trailer, rather than being able to kind of broaden this out to like a general thing and say, yeah, I'm not excited about the game as a whole. The stuff that I'm not super hyped about is stuff that I think my hype will increase with over time as we get to see more things, because obviously the summons and all that kind of stuff look really cool. The Final Fantasy things I saw look cool, but in terms of, I want to see a bit more of the characters, I want to see maybe a little bit more of the villain, I want to see a bit more of how magic's integrated. So I think like we need a little bit more sort of cool and wow factor, I think, with this sort of stuff, and I'm hoping that that's going to come in time. So I want to see some like epic looking sceneries, I want to see some epic looking arenas, I want to see some cool looking characters, I want to see some more gameplay. How close is it going to be to Remake Part 2, or is it looking more like 15 with even more like action and Devil May Cry kind of elements? Because I believe the guy who was in the Devil May Cry battle systems and that kind of stuff, he's also in this Final Fantasy 16 team. So there's going to be some Devil May Cry vibes as well. Devil May Cry is not a game I've played, so I can't be like super, so I don't really have too much to say about that side of things. I will continue to react as I see more content from Final Fantasy 16, but I'm just really, really glad it's happened. It came as a shock. My social media absolutely blew up. Like, everyone was just messaging it to me, like, going crazy. And I love just seeing that energy. The energy, the loyalty, and the passion of the Final Fantasy fan base is something that never ceases to amaze me. Everyone's excited, and I'm just, like, the future is looking bright. We got Remake Part 2 after a successful Remake Part 1. We got Final Fantasy 16 coming from the people who've done so well with Final Fantasy 14. So I think, like, the next few years of Square Enix Final Fantasy titles is looking good, and I'm really excited to see more. So those are my, like, initial thoughts and reactions about what I've seen. I can't really go too deep into it because I don't think we have a huge amount to go on here. We definitely need more, and I don't want to kind of try to draw any big major conclusions about the game just based off one trailer that we've seen so far. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Love to hear your thoughts as well. I will be doing a live stream fairly soon after this just to chat to you guys about what you think as well. Get a bit more sort of live interaction about what you guys made of this trailer too. So thank you all for watching. I will see you soon. I hope you enjoyed the trailer, and let's look forward to more Final Fantasy 16 build up together. Thanks for watching. Take care.